Imagine waking up tomorrow morning knowing that before the sun sets, you'll likely be dead. Not from sickness, not from old age, but torn apart by machine gun fire, buried alive by artillery shells, or slowly bleeding out in mud so thick it's like drowning on land. You don't know exactly how it'll happen, but you know it's coming. You can feel it in your bones, that feeling. That's what millions of soldiers woke up to during the First World War. And here's the brutal truth that historians rarely talk about. If you were transported to the trenches of the Somme or Verdun today, you wouldn't make it through breakfast. You wouldn't last a day. Not because you're weak, not because you lack courage, but because the human mind and body simply weren't designed to survive what those soldiers endured. We live in a time of comfort. We wake up in temperature-controlled rooms. We scroll through our phones. We complain about minor inconveniences. But imagine for just a moment what would happen if that comfortable life was suddenly stripped away. If you found yourself standing in a trench filled with water, rats, and the corpses of your friends. If the smell of decay and chemicals was so overpowering that you couldn't breathe without gagging. If the constant roar of explosions was so loud that you couldn't hear yourself think. And worse, couldn't hear the officers shouting orders that might save your life. That wasn't life in the trenches. That was hell, and it lasted for years. The First World War fundamentally broke something in human civilization. It wasn't just a war. It was industrial slaughter on a scale that the world had never seen before. Machine guns that could fire 600 bullets per minute. Artillery pieces that could hurl explosive shells miles across the landscape. Gas weapons that burned lungs from the inside out. And all of these weapons were aimed at soldiers standing in holes in the ground, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Between 1914 and 1918, approximately 20 million people died in that war. 20 million? That's not a statistic. That's incomprehensible human suffering. That's more people than live in Australia. All gone. Most of them young men in their 20s and 30s. Many of them conscripted against their will, forced to fight in a war they didn't understand for reasons they couldn't fully grasp. But here's what truly sets the trenches apart from any other conflict in human history. The absolute, crushing futility of it all. Soldiers didn't die fighting for ground they believed in. They didn't die defending their homes or their families. They died gaining and losing the same few hundred meters of devastated earth over and over again. Some offensives lasted months. Hundreds of thousands died. And when the smoke cleared, the front lines moved by maybe 2 miles. In some cases, they didn't move at all. Imagine spending 6 months fighting, watching your friends die day after day, night after night, and at the end of it all, the map looks exactly the same as it did when you started. That psychological destruction was often worse than the physical wounds. What you have to understand is that the trenches weren't just military positions. They were entire societies. They had hierarchies, rituals, rules, and cultures. Soldiers spent months, sometimes years in these trenches. They slept there. They ate there. They died there. Some trenches were separated from enemy trenches by as little as 50 meters. 50 meters. That means you could hear the enemy. You could hear them talking, coughing, moving around. You knew exactly where they were. They knew exactly where you were. And every day, you woke up knowing that at any moment, an officer might order you over the top and you'd have to run across no man's land. That terrifying stretch of earth filled with barbed wire and shell craters, while machine gun fire ripped through the air, and you'd probably die before you made it 10 meters. The physical conditions alone would destroy a modern person within hours. The mud. People don't understand mud until they've experienced trench mud. This wasn't like mud you'd encounter on a rainy day. This was mud made from pulverized earth, mixed with water, mixed with blood, mixed with human waste, because there were no proper sanitation facilities. Soldiers would get stuck in this mud, literally unable to pull their feet out. Some men died this way, swallowed by the earth. suffocating in mud while their friends watched helplessly. Other men had their feet slowly rot away. Trench foot was a genuine epidemic. Soldiers' feet would become infected, the flesh would decay, and the only solution was amputation. Thousands of men lost their feet, their toes, their ability to ever walk normally again, all because they were standing in mud and water for hours at a time. The smell is something that survivors consistently mentioned in their accounts, and it's almost impossible to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. Imagine the stench of 30,000 human bodies in a confined space. Imagine the smell of decomposition because there were always corpses in the trenches. Dead men from recent battles, men who'd been killed days or weeks earlier and hadn't been recovered. Imagine the smell of human waste because soldiers had nowhere to defecate except in designated areas in or near the trenches. Imagine the smell of chemicals from poison gas attacks, the smell of cordite from gunpowder, the smell of gangrene from infected wounds. Survivors reported that the smell was so overwhelming that experienced soldiers would faint if they first entered a trench where a major battle had recently taken place. The human nose eventually acclimated to it, but that first exposure was genuinely traumatizing. The rats were another horror that modern people rarely think about. These weren't normal rats. These were enormous creatures, some as large as cats, that thrived in the trenches because there was an endless supply of food. They fed on the corpses. They fed on the limited rations that soldiers tried to store. They would crawl over sleeping soldiers at night. Men would wake up with rats on their faces. Some soldiers reported seeing rats so large and so bold that they would attack living soldiers, biting at their faces and hands while the soldiers slept. The combination of mud, decomposition, and vermin created an environment so horrifying that it's almost impossible to comprehend from a place of comfort and safety. But if you could somehow survive the physical environment, there was the constant psychological assault. The sounds of the trenches never stopped. Artillery bombardments that lasted for days without end. Imagine the world's loudest thunder, but continuous, and it never lets up. Soldiers developed what was then called shell shock, what we now call PTSD, and it wasn't considered a legitimate condition back then. If a soldier couldn't function because of the constant noise and stress and fear, they weren't given medical leave. They were told to toughen up. In some cases, they were executed for cowardice if they refused to go over the top during an attack. That's right. Death wasn't just something that happened because of enemy action. Death was also punishment. Courts-martial handed down execution sentences for soldiers who broke down psychologically. Soldiers who'd survived weeks in the trenches watching their friends die. Soldiers whose minds had essentially fractured under the weight of the trauma. These men were shot by firing squads as an example to others. This wasn't rare. Thousands of men were executed for military crimes during the First World War. Most of them were suffering from what we now understand to be legitimate psychological conditions. But back then, they were traitors. They were cowards. They deserved to die. Now let's talk about the actual warfare. Let's talk about what happened when officers ordered an attack. A typical attack would begin with an artillery bombardment that might last for days. The idea was that the artillery would destroy the enemy trenches, tear up the barbed wire, eliminate the machine gunners who would mow down attacking infantry. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it rarely worked. The enemy trenches were deep. They were reinforced with concrete, and even when the artillery did damage them, the defending soldiers would retreat to secondary trenches, wait out the bombardment, and then set up their machine guns to cover no man's land. The barbed wire, oftentimes, wasn't fully destroyed by the artillery. It would be broken and torn, creating an even more lethal obstacle course. Then came the whistle. An officer would blow a whistle, and thousands of soldiers would climb over the parapets of their trenches and begin walking toward the enemy trenches. They didn't run. The trench commanders believed that soldiers should advance in organized waves, maintaining discipline and order. So these young men walked slowly across open ground in a line while enemy machine gunners tracked them with their weapons. Imagine hearing a machine gun fire for the first time in your life. Not from a movie or a video game, but hearing it in person. The sound is distinctive. It's a rapid, hammering stutter that continues endlessly. Boom, 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 without ceasing. And as you're hearing that sound, you're watching your friends around you suddenly drop. Some of them scream. Some of them are silent. Some of them are struck multiple times, their bodies performing grotesque dances as the bullets penetrated them. And you keep walking. You're ordered to keep walking, because if you stop, if you try to take cover, you'll be shot by your own officers. The British lost 20,000 soldiers on the first day of the Somme offensive. 20,000. Dead or dying in a single day. That's not an exaggeration. That's not propaganda from the enemy. That's the official record. Some British units advanced across no man's land and didn't reach the enemy trenches. They simply ceased to exist. Entire companies, hundreds of men, were cut down before they made it more than 100 meters. The survivors describe walking across a landscape that was completely transformed by warfare. Shell craters that filled with water and were now mass graves. Bodies piled on top of each other. Blood so thick on the ground that it looked like the earth itself was bleeding. And here's the thing that really breaks your mind when you read about this. The Somme lasted for months. The British didn't stop after the first day. They kept attacking. They kept sending more soldiers over the top, wave after wave of them, day after day, month after month. By the time the offensive ended, the British and French had suffered over 1 million casualties. The Germans, defending from fortified positions, had suffered fewer casualties, but still hundreds of thousands. And what did the Allies gain? A few miles of devastated earth. The front line moved, just barely. The objective of the offensive had been to break through German lines and create a breakthrough that would lead to a war of movement. It didn't happen. By the winter of 1916, the front lines were barely moved from where they'd been in the summer. This is the cycle that repeated over and over for 4 years. Attacks and counterattacks, offensives and defensive stands. Thousands dying for miles that meant nothing. The generals kept trying the same strategy because they didn't know what else to do. They didn't understand that machine guns and artillery had fundamentally changed warfare. They didn't understand that you couldn't win a trench war with cavalry charges or mass infantry assaults. So they kept throwing soldiers into the meat grinder, hoping that eventually they'd break through. Let's talk about what a day in the trenches actually looked like, because this is where you start to really understand why you couldn't do it. You'd wake up at dawn. If you were lucky, you'd have slept a few hours. If you were unlucky, you'd been on watch all night, standing in a trench filled with water, watching the enemy lines through the darkness. Either way, you're cold, you're wet, you're tired. Your body is exhausted in a way that modern people, with our comfortable beds and heating systems, can barely imagine. Your muscles ache, your joints hurt, you're hungry because the rations are barely enough to sustain you. Canned beef that's been sitting in storage for months. Biscuits so hard you can barely bite through them. Maybe some cheese, some jam. All of it tastes like it's designed to prevent you from enjoying food ever again. You're also terrified. Every second of every day you're aware that you could be killed. It's not an abstract fear. It's not something you think about occasionally. It's constant. It's like a pressure on your chest that never goes away. You look at your friends and you wonder which one will die today. You wonder if you'll watch him die, or if you'll be killed first. You think about your family. You think about home. You think about everything you'll never do if you die here. And then you try to push those thoughts away, because if you dwell on them, you'll lose your mind. You're also dirty in a way that you've never experienced. There's no way to wash in the trenches. There are no facilities. You haven't bathed in weeks, maybe months. Your uniform is crusted with mud and blood and filth. The same uniform that started out as a proper military garment is now a soiled rag. Your skin is covered in lice. Every single soldier in the trenches was infested with lice. They bit constantly. They spread disease. Soldiers would sometimes spend hours trying to kill them, burning them off with candles, crushing them between their fingernails. But it was futile. There were always more lice. You're also dealing with a constant low level of fear that's almost worse than the terror of active combat. The random artillery shells that land without warning, the snipers who wait for any glimpse of movement, the poison gas that drifts across no man's land, and you have to hope that your gas mask is nearby and that you can put it on in time before the gas reaches you. Gas was one of the most feared weapons in the trenches because it was indiscriminate. It didn't matter how brave you were. It didn't matter how well trained you were. If you weren't wearing a gas mask when the gas arrived, you died. And the gas masks themselves were horrifying. They were uncomfortable. They restricted your vision. They made it hard to breathe, but they were necessary. Many soldiers who survived poison gas attacks without masks were left with permanent lung damage. They suffered from gas poisoning for the rest of their lives, never able to breathe normally again. Throughout the day, there might be an artillery bombardment. Shells would land in the trenches, killing everyone nearby. These weren't distant explosions that you could pretend weren't happening. These were explosions that happened right next to you. You'd see your friends disappear in the explosion. You'd be standing next to someone, and then there would be a flash and a roar, and that person would be gone. Or worse, they'd be wounded. You'd have to help carry them to the aid station, assuming you could reach the aid station. Assuming the aid station hadn't been destroyed by artillery, and carrying a wounded soldier through the trenches was incredibly difficult. The trenches were crowded. They were narrow in some places. And if you tried to move quickly, you'd probably slip in the mud and fall, and then you'd both be stuck. Medical care in the trenches was primitive by modern standards. If you were wounded, the best you could hope for was that you'd be treated by a medic who would try to stop the bleeding, and then you'd be evacuated to a field hospital. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. There were always more wounded than there were doctors and nurses. Soldiers with severe wounds would sometimes die while waiting to be treated. Infections were rampant because everything was contaminated. The water was contaminated. The air was contaminated. Even a minor wound could become infected and result in gangrene, which meant amputation or death. If you were shot in the leg, you were lucky. You'd probably get evacuated. But if you were shot in the abdomen, you were probably going to die. The doctors couldn't do much for abdominal wounds back then. They'd try to stop the bleeding and stitch you up, but the infection risk was too high. You'd likely end up dead within days or weeks. And while you were dying, you'd be in constant pain. There were painkillers available, but they were rationed, so you'd just have to suffer. Nights in the trenches were worse than days. The darkness was absolute in most cases. There was no light except for the occasional flash of an artillery shell or a flare, and in that darkness anything could happen. The enemy might launch a night attack. You might accidentally shoot one of your own soldiers who was moving through the darkness. You might see things that weren't there, your mind playing tricks on you because of stress and exhaustion. Soldiers reported experiencing hallucinations. They reported seeing movement in no man's land that didn't exist. They reported hearing voices. The human mind, when pushed to the extremes of stress and sleep deprivation, begins to malfunction. And here's something that historians don't always emphasize: the tedium. If you survived the initial shock of entering the trenches, if you avoided being killed in an attack or by artillery, you'd be left with the endless crushing boredom. You'd be assigned duties. Maybe you'd be on watch for 4 hours. You'd stand there, looking out at no man's land, seeing nothing except corpses and barbed wire. Then you'd go to the fire step and wait. Maybe you'd be assigned to carry supplies. You'd carry ammunition or food or water through the trenches to the units that needed them. Maybe you'd be assigned to try to repair the trenches, filling in holes, trying to drain water, patching up the barbed wire. It was hard, futile work. The trenches would always deteriorate. The water would always return. The barbed wire would always be damaged. and you'd do this day after day. The same duties, the same fears, the same people. Many soldiers spent over a year in the same trench system. They got to know every corner of it. They knew where the weak points were. They knew where the snipers liked to hide on the enemy side. They knew which areas got shelled more heavily than others. They developed routines, rituals, ways of coping. Some soldiers would write letters home every day, knowing they might not be alive to send them. Some soldiers would talk about their dreams, of what they'd do after the war. Some soldiers would become numb, going through the motions of existence without really living. And then one day, an officer would blow a whistle, and that numbness would be shattered by pure animal terror as you climbed over the parapet and ran toward death. The casualties from disease were staggering and often overlooked. Disease killed more soldiers than combat in some cases. Trench fever, spread by lice, caused high fevers and severe pain. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water, resulted in severe diarrhea and dehydration. Pneumonia killed soldiers weakened by malnutrition and stress. Influenza, which swept through the trenches multiple times during the war, killed thousands. Soldiers were packed together in unsanitary conditions, and disease spread rapidly. A man could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening from pneumonia. This happened regularly, and psychological breakdown was constant. Soldiers who weren't killed by combat, who didn't die from disease, faced the very real possibility of losing their minds. The condition that was called shell shock back then was a response to the extreme stress and trauma of trench warfare. Soldiers would suddenly stop responding to commands. They'd curl up into fetal positions and refuse to move. They'd become catatonic. They'd have violent nightmares and night terrors. They'd experience complete dissociation from reality. And the military, not understanding mental health, treated these conditions as weakness or cowardice. Soldiers experiencing severe PTSD were given little sympathy. They were often court-martialed or simply left to suffer. The social dynamics in the trenches were complex and often brutal. There was a strict hierarchy. Officers lived in better conditions than enlisted men. They had warmer places to sleep. They had better food. They had more comfort. This bred resentment. Enlisted men felt that officers didn't understand what they were going through because officers didn't suffer as much, and in some cases, this was absolutely true. Some officers were relatively safe, directing operations from positions behind the frontline trenches. Some officers, however, were killed in the first waves of attacks, alongside their men. But the class distinction was always there. British society was deeply class stratified, and that stratification carried over into the military. Officers, usually from upper-class backgrounds, often didn't connect with their men, who were usually working-class or rural conscripts. Friendships in the trenches were intense and fragile. Soldiers formed deep bonds with their comrades because they were literally dependent on each other for survival. Your buddy's alert attention might spot a sniper before he shot you. Your buddy's strength might help pull you out of mud that was trying to swallow you. Your buddy's presence at night might be the only thing keeping you sane. These friendships were genuine and profound, but they were also constantly being shattered. Every day, you risked losing your best friend to an artillery shell or a sniper's bullet. Some soldiers developed a defense mechanism. They wouldn't allow themselves to get too close to anyone new because they knew that person might die. They'd seen too many deaths. They couldn't afford to care too much about anyone else. The food situation deserves its own discussion because it affected soldiers' morale and physical health immensely. The basic ration was supposed to be enough to sustain a soldier doing heavy labor, but it was barely adequate. The staple was bully beef, which was canned and had been treated with preservatives that gave it an unpleasant flavor. Biscuits, called hardtack or dog biscuits by soldiers, were so hard that soldiers often had to soak them in their tea or coffee to make them edible. They also had a tendency to attract weevils, so soldiers often had to crack them open and shake out the insects before eating them. There was bread when it was available, but it was usually stale and sometimes moldy. There were rations of jam, chocolate, sugar, and salt, but they didn't make up for the lack of fresh food. Soldiers were essentially eating processed, preserved food day after day. Some soldiers developed scurvy from the lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Others became malnourished, their bodies slowly wasting away because they weren't getting enough calories or nutrients. The lucky ones might get fresh meat or vegetables if their supply lines were working well. But in the frontline trenches, this was rare. Water was another critical issue. Soldiers needed water constantly, especially when they were in the trenches doing physical labor and stress eating away at their bodies. But the water in the trenches was often contaminated. It came from wells that were near areas where soldiers defecated. It picked up bacteria from corpses. It was sometimes deliberately poisoned by the enemy. So soldiers drank water that made them sick. They got dysentery. They got typhoid. They got cholera in some cases. Many soldiers developed a habit of drinking alcohol, particularly rum instead of water. They believed that the alcohol would kill the bacteria, and while it probably helped somewhat, they were also becoming alcoholics. Chronic alcoholism was rampant in the trenches. Soldiers would drink to cope with the fear and stress. They'd drink to numb themselves to the horror, and the military actually encouraged this to some extent. Officers would distribute rum rations before attacks, believing that alcohol would give soldiers courage. It didn't. It just made them drunk and less able to think clearly, which made them less likely to survive. Now let's talk about the weapons and the tactics that made trench warfare so deadly. The machine gun was the king of the trenches. The Maxim gun, which was in use during the First World War, could fire 600 rounds per minute. That's 10 bullets every second. In practical terms, it meant that a single machine gun, operated by 2 or 3 soldiers, could kill hundreds of infantry soldiers if they were charging across open ground. And they did. Hundreds of soldiers died to machine guns, often without ever seeing the soldiers who were operating the guns. The enemy would be hidden in their trenches behind barbed wire, and they'd mow down attacking soldiers with impersonal, mechanical efficiency. There was no heroism in dying to a machine gun. There was no glory. There was just death, sudden and inexplicable. You'd be running forward with your rifle, thinking about surviving, and then a machine gun would find you, and everything would end. Artillery was equally destructive. The artillery pieces in use during the First World War could fire shells that weighed hundreds of pounds, containing hundreds of pounds of explosives. When one of these shells landed near you, the blast would shred everything in the immediate area. Soldiers who survived artillery bombardments reported that the concussive force alone was enough to cause injury, even if you weren't hit by shrapnel. The sound was so loud that it could damage hearing. Multiple loud explosions in succession could cause permanent hearing loss. Survivors reported that they could never hear as well after the war. Some were completely deaf. Gas was another tool of industrial warfare. Poison gas was introduced during the First World War, and it was genuinely terrifying because it was invisible and indiscriminate. The most famous gas was mustard gas, which caused chemical burns on the skin and in the lungs. Soldiers exposed to mustard gas without protection would develop severe burns over their entire body. Their eyes would swell shut, blinding them. Their lungs would fill with fluid, and they'd essentially drown. Many soldiers survived mustard gas exposure, but were left with permanent disabilities. They were blind or deaf or had severe respiratory problems for the rest of their lives. Chlorine gas, which was used earlier in the war, was equally horrific. It caused pulmonary edema, which means the lungs would fill with fluid, and the victim would essentially suffocate. The way survivors described the experience of being gassed was absolutely horrifying. The burning sensation in the lungs, the panic as you realize you can't breathe, the knowledge that you might be dying and there's nothing you can do about it. Against these weapons, soldiers had rifles with bayonets, hand grenades, and not much else. The rifle was useful at close range, and soldiers would train extensively with it. But in the open ground of no man's land, during a daylight attack, The rifle was almost useless. You'd be seen before you got close enough to accurately shoot, and even if you did shoot, the enemy machine gunners were more numerous and had better fields of fire. Hand grenades were useful in trench raids or close-quarter combat, but they weren't effective against entrenched positions. So soldiers essentially went into battle with almost no effective means of defending themselves against the weapons arrayed against them. They were told to move forward and accept that many of them would die. This acceptance, this understanding that death was likely, was the psychological burden that soldiers had to carry. Now here's something that's crucial to understand. Soldiers didn't want to be there. Most of them were conscripted. They didn't have a choice. In many countries, military service was compulsory. Young men were taken from their homes, given minimal training, and sent to the trenches to kill and be killed. In some cases, they arrived at the front with just a few weeks of training. They didn't know how to handle their rifles properly. They didn't know how to survive in the trenches. They were led by officers, many of whom had also received inadequate training. This wasn't a professional army fighting a war with clear objectives. This was masses of hastily trained civilians, forced into a situation that most of them couldn't comprehend. The soldiers themselves, when given the opportunity to write or talk about their experiences, consistently reported a sense of futility and meaninglessness. They didn't understand why they were fighting. They didn't understand why so many of their friends were dying for what seemed like minimal gains. The trench warfare had no clear objective. It wasn't like earlier wars where you fought to take a city or defend a territory. In the trenches, you fought to hold or take ground that had no strategic value, no cultural importance, no meaning. You took a village, and the enemy counterattacked and took it back. This happened repeatedly. Soldiers on both sides knew that the entire situation was absurd, but they were trapped. They couldn't leave. They couldn't refuse orders. They could only wait and hope they survived until their tour ended, or until the war ended. And here's the real kicker. Many soldiers, after surviving years in the trenches, after watching their friends die, after accumulating trauma that would define the rest of their lives, went home to countries that didn't know how to handle them. They had what we now call PTSD, but back then it wasn't recognized as a legitimate condition. Veterans came home and were told to get over it, to move on with their lives. Many of them couldn't. They drank. They had nightmares. They had violent outbursts. Some of them committed suicide. Some of them became homeless because they couldn't readjust to civilian life. The psychological damage of the trenches extended far beyond the war itself. It affected entire generations. The human cost of the trench warfare is almost impossible to comprehend. During the first several months of the war, casualties were so high that both sides realized they couldn't sustain these losses indefinitely, but they couldn't figure out how to stop. The generals were convinced that the next offensive would break through. They were convinced that if they just killed enough enemy soldiers, eventually the enemy would run out of soldiers and surrender. But the enemy had the same belief. So the war continued. Millions died. Millions more were wounded. Entire villages in some countries saw their young men decimated. In some places, entire generations of men were killed or disabled, which had lasting effects on those societies for decades. Let's consider the perspective of someone from the modern world being put into these conditions. First, your body would likely reject the experience entirely. Your immune system would be overwhelmed by the contaminated environment. Within days, you'd likely develop dysentery or another infection. Your feet would start showing signs of trench foot. The lice would begin to spread rapidly across your body. Within a week, you'd probably be feverish and delirious. Within 2 weeks, if you hadn't been killed, you'd likely be evacuated to a hospital, barely conscious. Your mind would have already begun to fracture under the stress and horror. You'd have witnessed things that your brain was not evolved to witness. Humans aren't designed to see death on the scale that existed in the trenches. Our minds have mechanisms to shield us from the worst of it, but there are limits. Soldiers reported emotional numbness after a few weeks in the trenches. They simply stopped caring about anything. They stopped being afraid. They just existed in a state of emptiness, waiting for death. This emotional numbness is actually a documented psychological phenomenon. After extended exposure to extreme trauma, the brain essentially shuts down its emotional responses as a survival mechanism. Soldiers would describe themselves as becoming hollow. They'd watch their best friend die and they wouldn't cry. They wouldn't feel anything. That's not strength. That's psychological dissociation. It's the mind protecting itself from stimulus it can't process. When the war ended and soldiers came home, many of them found that they couldn't reactivate those emotions. They'd come back to their families and they couldn't feel love or joy or connection. They were alive, but in many ways they were broken. They remained broken for the rest of their lives. Now let's talk about some of the specific battles that exemplify just how nightmarish trench warfare truly was. The Battle of Verdun lasted from February to December of 1916. That's 10 months. During those 10 months, the Germans and French engaged in a grinding battle of attrition. Neither side was trying to break through. Both sides were essentially trying to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible, hoping that the enemy would eventually run out of soldiers first. By the end of the battle, there were approximately 700,000 casualties combined. 700,000 dead, wounded, missing, captured. 700,000 for terrain that, by the end of the battle, looked almost identical to how it had looked at the beginning. The front lines moved by a few miles in some places, but the strategic situation was unchanged. Both sides had bled themselves white for nothing. Soldiers at Verdun reported that the experience was beyond anything they could have imagined. The artillery bombardment was so intense that soldiers reported feeling like they were in hell itself. The shelling never stopped. For weeks at a time, there would be no break. Shells would land every few seconds. Soldiers would be driven mad by the constant noise and the constant expectation of death. Some soldiers reported that they felt they were living in a dream, that none of it was real. The human mind, when subjected to that level of stress, begins to question reality itself. You start to wonder if you're actually alive or if you died already and are just experiencing some kind of hell in the afterlife. That's not exaggeration. That's what soldiers actually reported. The Somme, which we discussed earlier, is considered one of the worst battles in human history. The British alone suffered over 400,000 casualties in that offensive. The French suffered over 200,000. The Germans suffered around 700,000, though some estimates place it higher. In total, over 1 million soldiers were casualties of that single offensive. And what was gained? Tens of miles of devastated earth, no breakthrough, no strategic victory, just 1 million casualties and a front line that looked essentially the same as it had before the offensive began. One of the most detailed accounts we have from a soldier at the Somme comes from a British private named Wilfred Owen. Owen survived the battle, but he was deeply traumatized by what he witnessed. He wrote poetry about his experiences, and his words capture the horror in a way that no historical account can fully convey. He wrote about soldiers being caught on barbed wire, about the smell of dead bodies, about the complete senselessness of the violence. Owen survived the Somme, but he was killed just days before the armistice that ended the war. He was shot by a machine gunner while trying to cross a river. He never made it home. Millions of other soldiers shared a similar fate. They survived the trenches only to be killed at the very end of the war, days or weeks before the fighting stopped. The psychological impact on soldiers who survived but were permanently changed was immense. Many soldiers developed what we now recognize as severe PTSD. They had flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance. Loud noises would cause them to have panic attacks or violent reactions. A car backfiring would send them into a state of panic because it sounded like gunfire. These symptoms often never went away. Veterans carried the trauma of the trenches for decades. Some never fully recovered. They spent the rest of their lives struggling with the demons that the war had created in their minds. There's a particularly haunting aspect of trench warfare that deserves attention: the raiding parties. In addition to the large-scale offensive operations, soldiers would conduct raids on enemy trenches. These were smaller operations, maybe 20 to 50 soldiers, who would cross no man's land and attack enemy positions. The purpose was usually to capture prisoners for interrogation, to steal supplies, or to boost morale by demonstrating that soldiers could be victorious in combat. These raids were incredibly dangerous. Many soldiers died. Many were wounded. And for what? The information gained from captured prisoners was often useless. The supplies captured were minimal. The morale boost was temporary. But from a psychological perspective, raids were interesting because they were the only time soldiers felt that they had any agency or control. They weren't just sitting passively while artillery shells rained down on them. They were actively fighting. They were trying to kill the enemy, and this actually had a positive psychological effect for some soldiers, at least temporarily. Combat, as horrifying as it was in some ways less psychologically damaging than the constant waiting and bombardment that characterized trench warfare. Soldiers who participated in successful raids often reported feeling more alive, more human, than when they were just sitting in the trenches waiting for death. The technology of the trenches was also fascinating from a historical perspective. Soldiers had developed incredibly elaborate trench systems. There were multiple lines of trenches, separated from each other by miles of communications trenches. The trenches had sophisticated drainage systems to try to manage the mud and water. They had firing steps so that soldiers could shoot over the parapets. They had command posts, aid stations, supply depots. It was in many ways an underground city, and the sophistication of these systems grew throughout the war as soldiers learned from experience how to build better defenses. But despite all this sophistication, despite all the engineering and planning, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Soldiers still had to attack across open ground defended by machine guns and artillery. No amount of engineering could solve that problem. One aspect of trench life that's often overlooked is the extreme boredom when there wasn't active combat. Soldiers would spend weeks in the trenches with nothing happening. No attacks, no heavy shelling, just routine patrols and maintenance. During these periods, morale would suffer. Soldiers would become depressed. They'd become listless. Without the adrenaline of combat or the fear of immediate death, they'd be left with their thoughts. They'd think about home. They'd think about their families. They'd think about what might happen to them. Some soldiers would find ways to cope. They'd play cards or write letters. Some would read if they could get books. Some would talk to their comrades. But the fundamental problem of boredom in a war zone is difficult to overcome. You're stuck in a hole in the ground, surrounded by death and horror, but nothing's happening, and you have to wait. You have to wait and wonder if you'll survive another day. The winter months in the trenches were particularly brutal. Cold temperatures made everything worse. Trench foot became more common. Frostbite was a constant danger. Soldiers would huddle together to try to stay warm. Their uniforms, which were designed for temperate weather, were inadequate for severe cold. Many soldiers froze to death in the trenches. Many lost fingers, toes, and entire feet to frostbite. The combination of cold and wet and mud and lack of proper clothing created conditions where soldiers' bodies literally began to break down. In some cases, soldiers welcomed the prospect of being wounded because it meant they'd be evacuated and could experience warmth and dryness for the first time in months. Let's talk about what happened to soldiers who were captured. The treatment of prisoners during the First World War was in many cases horrific. Some captured soldiers were executed immediately. Some were subjected to violence and abuse. Some were starved. Some were worked to death in labor camps. Many soldiers who were captured never came home. The fear of being captured was almost as great as the fear of being killed in combat. Soldiers often knew stories about what happened to prisoners, and these stories, whether true or exaggerated, fueled the fear. Some soldiers carried extra ammunition with the intention that, if they were about to be captured, they'd use the ammunition on themselves rather than allow themselves to be taken prisoner. The war had created such extreme conditions that suicide seemed preferable to capture. The medical corps did incredible work under impossible circumstances. Army surgeons and nurses worked around the clock, treating endless streams of wounded soldiers. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Surgeons performed amputations, removed shrapnel, tried to save lives with techniques that were primitive by modern standards, and the mortality rate for certain types of wounds was extremely high. A soldier with a head wound had almost no chance of survival. A soldier with damage to the abdomen had minimal chance. A soldier with damage to the chest and lungs had minimal chance. Essentially, if you were wounded in a critical area, you were going to die. The surgeons could patch you up, stop the bleeding, but infection and shock would likely kill you within days or weeks. Many soldiers who were saved by surgeons died later in hospitals from gangrene or infection. Amputation was common. Soldiers with severe wounds to their limbs would have those limbs removed. A soldier might arrive at a field hospital with a leg crushed by artillery, and within hours, that leg would be amputated. It might sound like a mercy, and in some ways it was better than the alternative of dying from infection. But imagine the psychological impact. You survive the trenches, you get wounded, you're evacuated, you survive surgery, but when you wake up, you discover that you've lost a limb. You're now permanently disabled. You'll spend the rest of your life as an amputee in a world that has no prosthetics technology, no wheelchair accessibility, no support systems for disabled people. Many amputees begged to be allowed to return to the trenches because they felt that was preferable to spending the rest of their lives as cripples, as they were called back then. The social stigma faced by disabled veterans was intense. Society didn't know how to handle them. They were supposed to be heroes, but they were also reminders of the horror of the war. Many people didn't want to see them. Many businesses didn't want to hire them. Many felt that the government wasn't taking proper care of them. Disabled veterans would sometimes sit on street corners begging for money because they had no other way to survive. In some countries, there were massive programs to try to rehabilitate and reintegrate disabled veterans, but the results were mixed. Many veterans spent the rest of their lives struggling with poverty and disability and psychological trauma. Let's talk about the nurses who worked in the field hospitals and hospitals behind the front lines. These were primarily women, and they experienced their own traumas as a result of the war. They worked in conditions that were almost as horrible as the trenches. They were surrounded by death and suffering. They tried to comfort dying soldiers. They held the hands of young men who were bleeding out. Many nurses developed psychological problems as a result of their experiences. Many of them never married or had children because they were too traumatized by what they'd experienced. The war affected women as well, though their experiences were different from those of the soldiers in the trenches. Women nurses witnessed the industrial slaughter firsthand. They couldn't escape it. They had to face it every single day. Now let's consider the perspective of a machine gunner. These were soldiers who operated the machine guns that killed so many attacking infantry. Many machine gunners reported that the experience of killing so many people was psychologically devastating. They'd see waves of soldiers coming toward them, and they'd fire their machine guns, and hundreds of soldiers would fall. From their perspective, it was like mechanically processing death. They weren't directly engaged in hand-to-hand combat. They weren't fighting for their lives. They were simply operating a tool that killed people. The psychological impact of being responsible for hundreds of deaths was immense. Many machine gunners developed severe PTSD. They reported seeing the faces of the soldiers they'd killed in their nightmares. They reported feeling guilt and shame despite having been doing their duty. Some of them committed suicide after the war. Others spent the rest of their lives struggling with guilt. Artillery crews had similar experiences. An artillery piece might kill dozens or hundreds of soldiers with a single salvo. The crews operating these pieces understood this intellectually, but it was difficult to maintain emotional distance. They weren't seeing the results of their fire directly. They were just loading shells and firing them, but they knew what those shells did. They knew that on the other side of the field, soldiers were dying or being maimed by their shells. The psychological burden was significant. The perspective of officers was also complex. Officers were responsible for the lives of their men. They had to make decisions that would result in deaths. They had to order men to attack, knowing that many of them would die. Some officers seemed to be immune to the psychological burden. Some of them appeared to view their soldiers as expendable resources, tools to be used to achieve military objectives. But many officers struggled deeply with the moral implications of their decisions. They had to live with the knowledge that they'd ordered men to their deaths. Many officers developed severe psychological problems. Many of them drank heavily. Many of them were unable to form normal relationships after the war, because they felt that they didn't deserve happiness after having caused so much suffering. The higher level command structure was often isolated from the reality of trench warfare. Generals would make decisions based on maps and reports, but they often didn't fully understand what conditions were actually like in the trenches. Some generals seemed to view the war as an abstract problem to be solved through application of will and resources, without fully comprehending the human cost. This disconnect between the people making decisions and the people experiencing those decisions led to many of the tragedies of the war. Generals would order offensives that had no realistic chance of success. They'd order soldiers to attack positions that were clearly impregnable. They'd believe reports that the enemy was nearly defeated, when in reality, the enemy was nearly as strong as ever. The gap between the general's perceptions and the reality of the situation led to millions of unnecessary deaths. As the war progressed, soldiers became increasingly cynical about the military leadership. They told dark jokes about their generals. They questioned the intelligence of officers who seemed to be making obviously bad decisions. They expressed frustration and anger at what they perceived as incompetence, and they weren't wrong. Many of the military strategies employed during the First World War were, in retrospect, clearly misguided. Generals were trying to apply 19th century tactics to 20th century warfare. They didn't understand that the machine gun and artillery had fundamentally changed the nature of combat. It took years and millions of deaths before military leaders began to adapt their strategies to the new reality of industrial warfare. The experience also created strange hierarchies and subcultures within the military. There were soldiers who volunteered and soldiers who were conscripted. There were professional soldiers who'd been in the military before the war and civilians pressed into uniform. There were soldiers from wealthy backgrounds and soldiers from working class backgrounds. There were soldiers from different regions and different countries. All of these groups had somewhat different experiences and perspectives, but they were also united by the shared trauma of trench warfare. Regardless of background, whether you were conscripted or volunteered, whether you were wealthy or poor, if you were in the trenches, you faced the same horrors and the same constant threat of death. Let's talk about the role of alcohol in the trenches. Alcohol was ubiquitous. Soldiers drank to cope with fear and stress. Officers distributed rum rations before attacks, believing that alcohol would give soldiers courage. Soldiers drank in the evenings to help themselves sleep. They drank because they were bored. They drank because they were terrified. They drank because they were grieving. Alcoholism was rampant. Many soldiers who survived the war came home with serious alcohol addiction problems. They'd become dependent on alcohol to cope with their trauma, and they continued drinking after the war to manage their PTSD symptoms. This led to an epidemic of alcoholism among veterans that lasted for decades after the war. Families were destroyed by the alcoholism of traumatized veterans. Children grew up with fathers who were chronic drinkers, aggressive, abusive. The psychological damage of the war rippled through multiple generations. Now let's consider what happened in what soldiers called the quiet sectors. These were areas of the front where active combat was relatively light. There might be occasional sniper fire or artillery bombardment, but there weren't continuous major offensives. Soldiers in these sectors could, in theory, be relatively safe. But the problem was that they never knew if the quiet would continue. At any moment, their sector could become active. They could be ordered to attack. The enemy could launch an attack on them. The routine of the trenches meant that soldiers were constantly preparing for combat that might never come, or that might come suddenly and without warning. This constant state of alert took a psychological toll. Soldiers couldn't truly relax. They couldn't let their guard down. They had to be ready to fight or die at any moment. The nature of sniping in the trenches deserves special attention. Snipers were individual soldiers who were exceptionally skilled with rifles. They would set up positions where they could observe and cover areas of no man's land or the enemy trenches. They would wait for hours, sometimes days, for a target to appear. When they saw a target, they would take a shot. The impact of snipers on soldiers' psychology was significant. Soldiers knew that, at any moment, they might be targeted by a sniper. They had to keep their heads down. They had to avoid predictable movements. They had to be constantly vigilant. A single moment of carelessness, a moment of looking over the parapet to check on the enemy position, could result in a bullet through the head. Many soldiers developed severe anxiety around snipers. They reported having nightmares about being shot by sniper fire. The invisible threat of the sniper created a constant low level of fear that persisted throughout soldiers' time in the trenches. Famous snipers became legendary. There were stories of snipers who'd killed hundreds of soldiers. There were counter-sniping operations where opposing snipers would try to locate and kill each other. These counter-sniping operations became intense personal conflicts. Snipers would study the patterns of enemy snipers. They'd try to predict where the enemy would set up. They'd try to ambush the enemy sniper. These duels between snipers were, in many ways, the most direct and personal form of combat that occurred in the trenches. It was one-on-one conflict in a war that was otherwise characterized by massive impersonal slaughter. The experience of soldiers who were at the very front of the trench line was particularly brutal. These were the soldiers who'd be the first to face an attacking wave. These were the soldiers who'd be the first to be hit by artillery fire. These were the soldiers who were most exposed to sniper fire. Soldiers would rotate between the frontline trenches, communication trenches further back, and rest areas even further back. But rotation schedules were often disrupted by military operations. Soldiers who were supposed to be rested might be pulled back into the front lines if there was an offensive. Soldiers who were supposed to have a few days of rest might be kept in the trenches because of manpower shortages. The lack of consistent rotation meant that soldiers were often exhausted, pushed beyond their psychological limits, and forced back into combat before they'd had adequate time to recover. Let's talk about what historians call the Christmas Truce of 1914, an event that exemplifies the humanity of soldiers despite the inhumanity of the situation. In December 1914, in some sectors of the Western Front, a spontaneous truce occurred. Enemy soldiers stopped fighting. British and German soldiers emerged from their trenches and met in no man's land. They shared food. They talked. They even played football together. This happened in multiple locations along the front. The truce lasted for days in some cases. It showed that soldiers, despite being ordered to kill each other, recognized their shared humanity. Officers, when they found out about the truce, were horrified. This wasn't supposed to happen. Soldiers were supposed to be focused on killing the enemy, not fraternizing with them. Orders were sent down to prevent future truces. Soldiers were told that fraternizing with the enemy would result in punishment. By 1915 and beyond, such truces were rare. The military leadership worked hard to prevent soldiers from recognizing that their enemy was just like them, also traumatized, also terrified, also just trying to survive. The food situation improved somewhat as the war progressed, but it never became adequate. By the later years of the war, soldiers were receiving slightly more food and slightly more variety. But malnutrition was still common. Soldiers were often thin and weak. Their bodies had wasted away from years of inadequate nutrition and constant physical stress. Many soldiers developed deficiency diseases. They had weak teeth from lack of vitamins. They had skin conditions from malnutrition. They were susceptible to every illness because their immune systems were compromised by poor nutrition. When soldiers came home after the war, many of them were essentially wrecks physically. They'd aged decades. They were thin and weak. It took years for many of them to recover physically from the nutritional deprivation of the trenches. Let's discuss the role of technology in creating the conditions for trench warfare. The combination of barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery meant that attackers were at a severe disadvantage. Defenders could set up behind fortifications and rain fire down on attackers who were advancing across open ground. This technological reality meant that the war became static. Neither side could achieve a breakthrough because the technology favored defense. This fundamental imbalance led to the grinding war of attrition that characterized the Western Front. Millions died in an attempt to overcome a technological reality that couldn't be overcome. Later in the war, tanks were introduced as a solution to the problem of breaking through entrenched positions. Tanks could theoretically cross no man's land protected from machine gun fire and destroy enemy trenches, but tanks were slow. They broke down constantly, and they weren't yet sophisticated enough to truly overcome the technological advantages of defense. It wasn't until the next war, the Second World War, that tanks and combined arms tactics became truly effective at breaking through entrenched positions. The smell, which we discussed earlier, deserves further exploration because survivors consistently cited it as one of the most memorable and traumatic aspects of trench warfare. The human nose can adapt to almost any smell, but the smell of the trenches was so overwhelming that it never fully adapted. Veterans reported that, decades after the war, certain smells would trigger memories of the trenches. The smell of decay, the smell of chemicals, the smell of human waste. These smells would instantly transport them back to the trenches. The trauma was encoded in their olfactory memory. They couldn't escape it. Even decades later, a similar smell could trigger a complete flashback to the horrors they'd experienced. This demonstrates the deep nature of the trauma. It wasn't just psychological. It was encoded in the brain at a very fundamental level, accessible through sensory cues that soldiers couldn't have anticipated or controlled. Now let's consider the experience of new recruits arriving at the front for the first time. These were usually young men, many of them barely 18 years old, who had minimal training and no combat experience. They would arrive at the trenches full of fear and confusion. The veteran soldiers, the ones who'd been there for months or years, would watch these new recruits with a mixture of pity and resentment. They knew what was going to happen. They knew that many of these young men would be dead within weeks. Some of the veterans would try to help the new recruits, teach them how to survive. Others were too damaged to care. The new recruits would experience the trenches as complete sensory overload. Everything was new and horrifying. The sounds, the smells, the constant danger. Their brains were being exposed to stimulus that they had no framework to process. Most new recruits would spend their first few days in a state of shock. The mortality rate for new recruits in their first month was extraordinarily high. Estimates vary, but in some units, a significant percentage of new recruits would be killed or seriously wounded within their first month. This high mortality rate for new recruits was actually an opportunity for psychological evolution. The survivors among the new recruits, the ones who made it through the first month, would begin to develop the psychological adaptations that veteran soldiers had. They'd become more callous. They'd learn to suppress their emotions. They'd learn to focus on immediate survival rather than thinking about the bigger picture. In a sense, The trenches selected for soldiers who could psychologically adapt to extreme conditions. The ones who couldn't adapt were killed. It was brutal natural selection in a military context. The role of leadership at the small unit level was crucial. Squad leaders, sergeants, and junior officers who directly led soldiers in combat had enormous influence over morale and survival rates. A good leader could keep his unit focused and organized, which increased survival chances. A bad leader could send his unit on suicidal missions. Soldiers in units with good leadership had higher morale and lower casualty rates. Soldiers in units with bad leadership were more likely to develop serious psychological problems or get killed. The personal relationships between leaders and soldiers mattered immensely. A leader who showed genuine concern for his soldiers, who didn't waste lives on pointless orders, would generate loyalty and better performance. A leader who seemed indifferent to the suffering of his soldiers would generate resentment and reduced effectiveness. The concept of honor in the trenches was complicated. Soldiers were told that it was an honor to serve their country, an honor to fight and die for their nation. But the reality of the trenches contradicted this narrative. Many soldiers felt that there was nothing honorable about dying in the mud for no strategic purpose. They felt betrayed by the narrative that was being used to justify their sacrifice. This created a disconnect between what soldiers were being told and what they were experiencing. Some soldiers maintained a belief in honor and duty throughout the war. Others became cynical, viewing the entire war as a pointless waste of human life. This cynicism, this questioning of the entire enterprise, was actually a sign that soldiers were thinking clearly about their situation. They recognized the absurdity of what was happening. Let's talk about the mail system in the trenches. Soldiers would receive letters and packages from home, and these would have an enormous psychological impact. A letter from loved ones could lift a soldier's spirits for days. It would remind them that they had people who cared about them, people who were waiting for them to come home. Many soldiers would read and reread letters until they fell apart from the handling. They would sleep with letters under their pillows. The mail was, in many ways, a lifeline to normalcy, to the world that existed outside the trenches. But mail also had the potential to cause psychological distress. Bad news from home could devastate a soldier. A letter saying that a loved one had died, that a wife or girlfriend had left him, that the family farm had been seized for debt. These letters would compound the trauma that soldiers were already experiencing. Some soldiers received letters telling them things that made them question whether they had anything to come home to. The phenomenon of soldier's heart, which was one of the early descriptions of what we now call PTSD, was recognized during the First World War, though not fully understood. Soldiers would develop severe anxiety, heart palpitations, difficulty breathing, and other symptoms that seemed to have no physical cause. Doctors were puzzled by these symptoms. They called it soldier's heart or combat neurosis. Some doctors believed it was a legitimate medical condition. Others believed soldiers were malingering, faking symptoms to avoid combat. The soldiers themselves knew what was happening. Their bodies and minds were broken by the trauma of the trenches. But because the medical and military establishment didn't fully recognize the condition, soldiers suffering from soldier's heart were often treated with contempt. They were told to toughen up, to stop complaining, to get back to duty. Some soldiers' hearts literally failed, and they died in the trenches or shortly after from heart conditions brought on by the extreme stress. The treatment of officers captured by the enemy was often better than the treatment of enlisted men. Enemy forces recognized officers' rank and sometimes treated them with respect. Officers might be held in officer camps where conditions were better than in enlisted prisoner camps. But enlisted men faced harsher treatment. There was a class distinction in how prisoners were treated, much as there was a class distinction in how soldiers lived in the trenches. This inequality, even in captivity, demonstrated how deeply embedded class divisions were in the military systems of the time. Let's consider the perspective of soldiers from different countries. French soldiers experienced trench warfare somewhat differently than British soldiers, who experienced it differently than German soldiers. The cultural backgrounds, the training, the command structures were all different. But the fundamental horror was the same. Soldiers from all nations reported similar experiences of fear, trauma, disease, and despair. A French soldier suffering from shell shock experienced the same psychological symptoms as a German soldier suffering from shell shock. The trauma of trench warfare transcended national boundaries. In that sense, soldiers from all nations shared a common bond. They were united by their shared suffering. The psychological concept of cognitive dissonance played a role in how soldiers coped with the trenches. Soldiers had been told that their cause was just, that they were fighting for their nation, for their families, for a righteous purpose. But the reality of the trenches contradicted this narrative. They weren't seeing a righteous war. They were seeing pointless slaughter. This contradiction between belief and reality created psychological stress. Some soldiers resolved this stress by doubling down on their belief in the righteousness of their cause. Others resolved it by rejecting that belief and becoming cynical. Still others compartmentalized, refusing to think too deeply about the contradiction and just focusing on survival. As the war entered its final year, soldiers knew the end was coming. Intelligence reports suggested that Germany was running out of resources and manpower. Soldiers began to hope that the war would end soon. They began to take more risks because they thought they might survive if they could just hold on a little longer. Paradoxically, this hope sometimes led to increased casualties because soldiers were less cautious, less focused on survival, more focused on the possibility of going home. Some soldiers died in the very last days of the war, killed by someone who was equally hoping that the war would end in just a few more days. Imagine that tragedy. You survive 4 years of trench warfare, and you're killed days before the armistice. It happened. Thousands of soldiers were killed in the final weeks of the war. The armistice, when it finally came on November 11th, 1918, was both a relief and an anticlimax for many soldiers. There were celebrations in some areas. Soldiers shot their weapons into the air in celebration. But in other areas there was a strange quiet. Soldiers were numbed. They'd lived for years with the expectation of death, with combat, with horror. Suddenly it was over. They didn't know how to react. Some soldiers felt immediate joy. They'd survived. They'd made it home, but others felt empty. Their entire existence for years had been focused on warfare and survival. Suddenly that was gone. They didn't know who they were outside of the context of being a soldier. This existential confusion contributed to the difficulty many veterans had in adjusting to civilian life after the war. The immediate aftermath of the war saw millions of soldiers being demobilized. Armies that had millions of soldiers began reducing to peacetime levels. Millions of men were discharged and expected to return to civilian life. But they were not the same men who'd left. They were traumatized. They were addicted to alcohol. They were psychologically broken. They had skills that were only useful in warfare. They had no job skills for civilian life. They had untreated psychological conditions that would impact them for the rest of their lives. Governments largely ignored their needs. There were no comprehensive mental health systems. There were no rehabilitation programs. Veterans were on their own. Many of them struggled deeply in the years after the war. Many of them never fully recovered. The economic impact on soldiers was also severe. The war had disrupted the normal economy. When soldiers returned, they re-entered a job market that was disrupted and unstable. Many businesses had been damaged or destroyed. Many industries had been retooled for wartime production and had to be retooled again for civilian production. Jobs were not immediately available for millions of returning veterans. Many veterans ended up poor. Many became homeless. Many turned to crime out of desperation. Some countries eventually provided veterans benefits, but these were often inadequate. Veterans who'd lost limbs or suffered from diseases contracted in the war faced additional challenges in trying to survive economically. The marriages and family relationships of veterans were often devastated. Many soldiers had been married before the war. They'd left wives behind to go to war. After years of separation, sometimes 6 years or more, they returned changed. Their wives had often grown or changed as well. The reunion was sometimes joyful, but often it was awkward or painful. Many marriages failed. Many veterans couldn't connect emotionally with their spouses because they were emotionally numb from trauma. Many marriages ended in divorce. Many children grew up with fathers who were emotionally absent or abusive. The damage to the family unit extended the trauma of the war through generations. Some soldiers, when they returned, found that they couldn't readjust to civilian life under any circumstances. They felt like outsiders. Civilians didn't understand what they'd been through. Civilians seemed trivial and shallow, with their concerns about jobs and money and social status. Veterans often felt alienated from civilian society. Some of them formed communities with other veterans because other veterans were the only people who truly understood what they'd experienced. In some countries, these veterans' organizations became quite powerful politically. In Germany, for instance, the disruption caused by millions of unemployed, traumatized veterans contributed to political instability and the rise of radical political movements. The Second World War, in many ways, had its seeds planted in the aftermath of the First World War, specifically in how traumatized veterans were treated and how their needs were ignored. Let's talk about the soldiers who were captured late in the war and held as prisoners for extended periods. These soldiers missed the entire demobilization process. When the war ended, they were prisoners. They had to wait for their captors to be convinced to release them. Some prisoners weren't released for months or even years after the war ended. These soldiers missed the initial transitions. They spent additional months or years in captivity after the fighting had stopped. Many of them never fully recovered from the trauma of being prisoners in addition to having been soldiers. The combination of battlefield trauma and imprisonment trauma was too much for many of them to overcome. The long-term health consequences of trench warfare extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Veterans developed chronic health conditions. Many had permanent hearing loss from exposure to loud explosions. Many had lung damage from poison gas exposure or from the constant inhalation of smoke and chemicals. Many developed arthritis and joint problems from years of living in damp, cold conditions. Many developed digestive problems from years of inadequate nutrition and contaminated food. Many developed skin conditions from years of exposure to chemicals and filth. Veterans aged rapidly. A veteran in his 30s often looked like he was in his 60s. The war had literally aged them. Veterans' life expectancy was lower than their civilian peers. They were more susceptible to disease. They died younger. The suicide rate among veterans was extraordinarily high, though it wasn't always officially recorded as such. Many veterans killed themselves in the years after the war. The psychological damage was simply too great. They couldn't live with the memories. They couldn't live with the nightmares and flashbacks. They couldn't live with the PTSD symptoms that never went away. They couldn't live with the sense of having failed, of having survived when their friends died. They couldn't live with the guilt. Some of these suicides were direct and obvious. Veterans would shoot themselves or hang themselves. Others were slower, more indirect. Veterans would drink themselves to death. Veterans would take unnecessary risks that resulted in their deaths. Veterans would engage in self-harm. The trenches killed soldiers long after the war ended. The cultural impact of the First World War on literature and art was profound. Writers who'd experienced the trenches returned home and began writing about their experiences. They wrote novels, poetry, plays, all attempting to capture the horror of what they'd witnessed. These works became incredibly important because they provided future generations with detailed accounts of what the trenches were actually like. Authors like Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, provided unflinching descriptions of trench warfare that made the horror visceral and real for readers who'd never experienced combat. Remarque's novel was so powerful, so emotionally devastating, that it changed how people thought about war. Reading his description of soldiers dying in the trenches, readers began to question the narrative that war was heroic or glorious. Literature became one of the primary ways that the true nature of trench warfare was communicated to future generations. Poets also documented the war. Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, and others wrote poetry that captured both the beauty and the horror of the experience. Owen's famous line, "The pity of war," became a touchstone for understanding the emotional impact of the conflict. These poets recognized that war wasn't glorious. It was tragic. It was a waste of human potential. It was the destruction of an entire generation of young men. Their poetry helped to transform public understanding of what war actually meant. Before the First World War, war was often romanticized. After the war, particularly after reading the accounts of soldiers and the poetry and literature they produced, it became harder to romanticize war. Visual artists also responded to the war. Painters who'd experienced the trenches created works that attempted to capture the psychological impact of warfare. These paintings were often disturbing and nightmarish. They showed fragmented figures, distorted landscapes, scenes of chaos and confusion. These artworks communicated the psychological disorientation of soldiers in ways that traditional realistic art couldn't. Art movements like Expressionism and Dadaism emerged partly as responses to the horrors of the war. Artists felt that traditional artistic methods couldn't adequately express the radical disruption that the war had caused to human civilization. Photographers also documented the war. Though photography wasn't as advanced as it would later become, photographers managed to capture images of the trenches, of soldiers, of the landscape of battle. These photographs provided concrete visual evidence of what the trenches looked like. Photographs of men standing in mud, of destroyed buildings, of soldiers in gas masks. These images were powerful documentation. They couldn't capture everything, but they could convey some sense of the conditions that soldiers endured. The formation of veterans' organizations after the war was significant. In many countries, veterans organized into groups that advocated for veterans' benefits and recognition. These organizations provided social connection and support for veterans. They helped some veterans process their trauma by connecting them with others who understood their experiences. But veterans' organizations also sometimes became politicized. In some countries, veterans became involved in right-wing or left-wing political movements. The alienation and disruption that many veterans felt made them susceptible to extreme political ideologies that promised solutions to the chaos they perceived in society. The question of how to memorialize the war became important. In the decades after it ended, war memorials were erected in towns and cities across Europe and around the world. These memorials listed the names of soldiers who'd been killed, or in some cases, simply honored the sacrifice of soldiers. The creation of these memorials was, in many ways, an attempt to find meaning in the massive loss of life. If all those soldiers could be named and remembered, perhaps their deaths had some significance. But for many people, particularly veterans, the memorials felt inadequate. No memorial could truly honor the sacrifice of millions. No memorial could adequately capture what had been lost. The economic burden of war was also significant. The war had cost enormous amounts of money. Governments had incurred massive debts financing the war. After the war, these debts had to be repaid. The financial burden contributed to economic difficulties in the years after the war. Some countries struggled with inflation. Some countries struggled with unemployment. The economic disruption contributed to political instability. In Germany, for instance, the economic difficulties and the sense that Germany had been unjustly treated in the Treaty of Versailles contributed to political resentment that would eventually lead to the rise of Nazi Germany. The question of responsibility for the war became a major point of contention in the peace negotiations and in the decades afterward. Different countries blamed different entities for causing the war. Germany was required, under the Treaty of Versailles, to accept responsibility for the war and to pay reparations to the victorious nations. This was seen by many Germans as unjust, and the resentment over these terms contributed to political instability in Germany. The question of who was responsible for the war is still debated by historians today. Was it Germany's militarism? Was it Austria-Hungary's aggression towards Serbia? Was it the system of alliances that made a regional conflict spiral into a continental war? Was it the militarism of all the great powers? The answer is probably that multiple factors contributed. But the way that responsibility was assigned, with Germany receiving the bulk of the blame, had significant consequences. The League of Nations was created after the war with the intention of preventing future wars. The theory was that if nations had a forum for discussing disputes, they could avoid wars. But the League ultimately failed to prevent the Second World War. The League was weak. It had no enforcement mechanism. Countries could simply ignore League decisions. The League couldn't effectively mediate between powerful nations with conflicting interests. The failure of the League contributed to a sense of cynicism about international organizations that persisted for decades. The question of military reform emerged after the war. Military leaders began to question whether the tactics that had been used during the First World War were actually effective. They began to develop new strategies based on the lessons of trench warfare. The development of armor, of air power, of combined arms tactics. These were all responses to the problems that had emerged during the First World War. Military leaders were trying to ensure that the grinding stalemate of trench warfare never happened again. To some extent, they succeeded. The Second World War, though still devastating, didn't have the same static trench warfare that characterized the First World War. But ironically, some of the new tactics and technologies, combined with industrial capacity, led to even higher casualty rates in the Second World War. Let's return to the core question. Why wouldn't you last a day in the trenches? The answer is multifaceted. Physically, your body would break down. The contaminated environment would cause infections. The cold and wet would cause trench foot and frostbite. The lack of adequate food would cause malnutrition and disease. The constant noise of explosions would cause hearing loss. Within days, you'd likely be showing signs of serious illness. Within weeks, you'd probably be evacuated from the trenches due to physical incapacity. Psychologically, your mind would fracture. The constant threat of death, the witnessing of others dying, the helplessness in the face of industrial slaughter, these would overwhelm your psychological defenses. You would experience terror that you'd never imagined possible. You would develop anxiety and hypervigilance. You would have nightmares and flashbacks. Your sense of self would begin to dissolve. The numbness that long-term soldiers developed as a defense mechanism wouldn't protect you because it takes time to develop. You'd be overwhelmed by raw emotion. Emotionally, you would be devastated. You would watch friends die. You would experience grief that would be compounded by the need to immediately refocus on survival. You would feel rage at the officers who ordered suicidal attacks. You would feel despair at the apparent meaninglessness of your suffering. You would feel guilt at surviving when others died. These emotions would be so overwhelming that you'd probably reach a breaking point relatively quickly. The combination of physical breakdown, psychological fracture, and emotional devastation would make it almost impossible for you to continue. Most modern people, dropped into the trenches of the First World War, would last days or maybe weeks before they either died or were evacuated due to physical or psychological incapacity. A few might last months through a combination of luck and adaptation. Very few would survive the entire war and emerge relatively intact, as many soldiers did. But here's what's important to understand. the soldiers who experienced the trenches weren't superhuman. They weren't fundamentally different from you or me. They were ordinary people, conscripted from towns and cities across their nations. They had the same fears, the same vulnerabilities, the same basic needs that we do. What made them different was simply that they were exposed to conditions that forced them to adapt or die. Some of them adapted, some of them died, some of them survived physically but died psychologically. The war was a crucible that transformed millions of ordinary people into either traumatized survivors or corpses. The legacy of the First World War trenches extends to how we think about warfare today. The phrase, "never again," became associated with the First World War, particularly after people fully understood the scale of casualties. Never again would we allow such pointless slaughter, people said. Never again would we send young men to die in muddy trenches for miles of meaningless terrain, people said. And yet warfare continues. The Second World War was even more devastating than the First World War in terms of total casualties. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, modern conflicts in the Middle East all have their own horrors, their own casualties, their own traumatized survivors. But the trenches of the First World War remain, in many people's minds, the ultimate symbol of the futility and horror of war. They represent the moment when industrial civilization first applied its full technological capacity to the problem of killing other humans. The scale of death, the scale of suffering, the apparent meaninglessness of it all. These combine to make the First World War trenches a powerful reminder of what happens when nations choose war. The soldiers themselves became, in many ways, the first soldiers to be truly documented through modern media. Photographs, films, written accounts, all of these provided detailed documentation of what soldiers experienced. This documentation meant that future generations could actually understand, at least to some degree, what soldiers went through. Unlike wars before the First World War, where documentation was less complete, the horrors of the trenches were preserved and communicated to future generations. This documentation has been crucial in helping people understand why war is a tragedy, not a glory. The treatment of soldiers after wars has changed somewhat as a result of understanding what the First World War soldiers went through. Modern militaries, particularly in developed nations, now have systems to treat trauma. They recognize PTSD as a legitimate condition. They provide counseling and medical care to traumatized soldiers. They attempt to reintegrate veterans into civilian society. But the fundamental challenge remains. How do you help someone return to normal life after they've experienced extreme trauma? The answer is that it's very difficult. Many veterans still struggle, still have nightmares, still have problems relating to civilian society. The awareness of veterans' needs has improved, but the underlying problem of war trauma hasn't been solved. The First World War trenches also stand as a warning. They show what happens when military technology advances beyond the tactics that are being used. The machine gun and artillery rendered 19th century tactics obsolete, but it took years and millions of deaths before military leaders adjusted to this new reality. In modern times, this is a relevant warning. Weapons technology continues to advance. Drones, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence in weapons systems. These represent new technological capabilities that may not be matched by new tactical understanding. If history repeats, if military leaders fail to adapt to new technology and new reality, the results could be catastrophic. Finally, let's consider the fundamental question. What did the First World War actually accomplish? What was the purpose of all that death and suffering? Germany was defeated and forced to accept harsh peace terms. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was dismantled. The Russian Empire had already collapsed into civil war. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled. The colonial powers, Britain and France, emerged nominally victorious, but economically exhausted. Millions of young men were dead. Millions more were wounded, an entire generation was lost, and the peace that resulted from the war was unstable. The seeds of the Second World War were planted in the harsh treatment of Germany after the First World War. The instability in the Middle East, caused by the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and the redrawing of borders, continues to this day. In many ways, the First World War solved nothing. It created new problems,